Alright, so in this video we are going to be starting our new unit on evolution. So evolution's probably one of my favorite units to talk about. How do we trace inheritance, and how do we see how different organisms adapt to different environments over time is basically what we're going to cover in this. We're going to go through a couple different topics about natural selection, isolation, how do we know that evolution has occurred, and we're going to break this down. So the first thing I want you to do is kind of a intro to the lesson. I want you to think like Darwin. I've got a couple of different organisms. 3 of these have videos. The other one is over here on the right. This is a dead leaf or oak leaf butterfly. I want you to create an inference. Inference is just an educated guess about why these organisms look or behave the way they do. So the butterfly, why does it look like a dead leaf on the outside but has all these bright colors on the inside? The barrel eye fish, why does it look and behave kind of like it does? Barrel eye fish are found at the bottom of the ocean. They have translucent heads that they can actually see through, and their main goal, you'll see in the video, is to look upwards. So why do they do that? The third video is a giant katydid. You'll hear it and the call that it makes. Why does it do that? And the last one is a clip from one of the Ice Age movies. Is what I'm calling a dinosaur butterfly. So why does this dinosaur butterfly look the way it does in the movie? So once you finish those, you'll submit it onto Schoology. There's a spot towards the bottom, or a spot labeled with a couple of different things. This will be one of the things you turn in for today. So the other thing that we're going to cover today is Darwin and his theory of natural selection. So first thing I want you to do, take a couple minutes, watch through this video. It's only about 5 minutes long. There's a couple questions on your notes that I would like you to follow along with the video. You can pause it to write things down, but I would like you to follow along with the video and answer the questions, and again, submit them to Schoology so that I can see that you got the basic understanding of what I was trying to get out of this video. So, couple people that you'll want to know for this unit. The first one, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He is a French scientist, and he was a naturalist. This just means that he was kind of before the era of biology, when we were all about studying the natural world. That's what a naturalist is. But he came up with this idea that believed that individuals evolve and pass on acquired traits to their offspring. So you can see over here we have Lamarck's giraffe. Originally they started with short-necked ancestors, and over time they just kept stretching their necks even higher and higher and higher until eventually they reached the leaves that they wanted to eat. So this drive was fueled by their need to eat the leaves on top of the tree. So he believed that life gets more complex throughout time, which is something that we will continue thinking about with the rest of this unit. But his main idea was the idea of use and disuse, that we either use traits and keep them, or we don't use traits and we lose them. So take a minute. Why do you think this was kind of in the wrong? Why do you think Lamarck's theory wasn't completely right? So pause the video, take a minute, think about this. Okay, so Lamarck's theory was good. I mean, he talked about traits being passed on. However, he was talking about acquired traits. And these acquired traits, the desire or need to do something. That's not how nature works. Nature is much more complicated than that. For example, there was a piece of research done where scientists actually cut off the tails of lab rats and had lab rats produce offspring. Those offspring regrew their tails. So even though we chopped off the tail, it was still necessary or it was still kept by the following generations, even though we chopped off the parents. So that trait or that harm was not passed on to the offspring. Same thing with this. Just because you stretch farther and farther to reach something doesn't mean that your offspring are going to be born with really long arms. So this is where Charles Darwin came in. So his theory, or this comment, as this comment says, it's not the strongest species that survives nor the most intelligent. It's the one that is most responsive to change. So just a little bit of background on Darwin. Darwin was a very nature-loving boy. He loved to get outside. He liked to play with plants. He liked to play with insects. He liked to just look at everything in nature. At the time, though, it was very hard to become a professional scientist. There was not a lot of people that could get paid well for studying the natural environment. So what did he do? He decided to get a job as a parson, or a religious individual. So he went to theology school, and he did really well in school, but most of the time that he spent with other professors was with the natural philosophers. So this, what we would call the scientists at the time, the people who tried to think about or understand the natural world. So he was very big into this natural philosophy. And at some point, we had this captain who came to the university. He needed someone who could be a naturalist for their expedition. They were going to take a really long 5-year expedition to go and study a bunch of different countries. And of course, the science professors were like, yeah, take Darwin. He's the best we've got. So Darwin went on this HMS Beagle trip, and he went for 5 years exploring around the world. He started out in Europe, traveled to South America, hit a bunch of different places in South America, Rio de Janeiro, Montevideo, Falkland Islands, bounced around the Cape of Africa, or of South America, and up to the Galapagos Islands. He spent a lot of time at the Galapagos Islands researching the different organisms that lived there. He then moved across the ocean through Tahiti, over to Australia, did some research in Australia, up in kind of the Indo-Pacific region, before jumping over to Africa, hitting the Cape of Africa, before jumping back over to South America and then back to Europe. So he went all over the world. This was a 5-year expedition where all he did was looked at plants and animals and take samples. And what he found was that after he took many, 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 many years of reviewing his specimens, of gathering evidence, he developed a theory on how natural selection, how the selection of different traits affects nature. In his mind, he wasn't sure about publishing it just because he knew the theory was going to be controversial. At the time, the major governing power was the Catholic Church, and anyone who had differing ideas, for example, the idea that animals were produced by something other than divine creation, was not something that the Catholic Church liked to put up with. So he ended up publishing his book on the origin of species, or as the full name, The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. So he published that, and then a little bit after, he published his second book on the descent of man, how humans are descended from Neanderthals and how humans have evolved over time. So that was his second book. Again, a lot of controversy around it, but he did end up publishing it. Now, the reason that he did go through and didn't hold off his entire time waiting was because of a man named Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace was another naturalist, another geographer, and he traveled the world in the 1850s, and he came up with his own idea of evolution through natural selection. So same idea that Darwin was about to publish, Wallace comes in, sends a letter to Darwin and says, hey, I have this idea. Can you look over it? Can we talk about it? And the two end up collaborating on a scientific paper about natural selection. But Darwin, wanting most of the glory for the theory, he goes through the next year and publishes his book on the origin of species. So this now sets out the idea of natural selection to the world, and Wallace gets left behind. So a lot of the time we don't think of Alfred Russel Wallace for his contributions to evolution, even though he played a very important role in helping Darwin to kind of finalize his thoughts of the idea. So Darwin, of course, produces his book on the origin of species. I have one myself. I have not finished reading it. But if you are into natural selection, if you're into any sort of nature things, I would highly recommend picking one up. But take a minute and think about it. Why was this theory of evolution so groundbreaking at the time? Okay, so the theory of evolution, as we said, organisms are, traits are passed on over time, and organisms have evolved from other organisms. This went completely against what people thought at the time. People thought because the Catholic Church had their doctrines and had all of their notes and things, that animals were created by divine beings and that were just set there on the earth for us to use. The theory of evolution kind of shoved that off to the side because we have these organisms that are not only adapting to their environment, that are changing over time, but are producing new organisms, which is not something that people thought about. The theory of evolution also kind of put humans down at the rank of animals rather than keeping us up above the animals. Everyone typically thinks that humans are much more complex and therefore above other animals. But Darwin's On the Descent of Man pretty much said that we evolve the same way that any other organism does. So breaking down Darwin's theory of evolution and of natural selection, Darwin had a lot to go over. A couple of things that he mainly pointed out was this idea of survival of the fittest, where those who have the best traits that are suited for the environment are going to survive. So if we have a rabbit that has a very thick coat, if we live in an Arctic environment, it's going to have a better chance of survival than a rabbit with a very thin coat. And this is going to be driven by natural selection. So the selection of these best suited traits, so that only the ones that have the best traits are going to reproduce. However, he focused mostly on adaptive characteristics, the characteristics such as beak size, of coat shape or coat thickness, of neck length, mostly about physical characteristics. His other idea was the idea of descent with modification, that all species change over time and give rise to new species. So, for example, on the Galapagos Islands, you'll have a reading here in a little bit. On the Galapagos Islands, we have like 13 or 14 different species of finch. These are referred to as Darwin's finch or Galapagos finch. Each finch has a different beak shape, but all of those came from one individual that flew to the island back when it was first created. Those species were then split apart from the original, and that's why they all developed into their own species. So Darwin focused on characteristics and how they were passed on to the next generation. But there was another scientific breakthrough from the 1800s that would have helped Darwin step his theory a little bit farther. And that is genetics. So we just talked about genetics. Genetics, the inheritance of traits, the inheritance of genes and of alleles, how we get two alleles from our parents and how those can determine what our phenotype or our physical characteristics are going to look like. So the current theory of evolution takes both sides into account. takes Darwin and his theory of evolution, takes Gregor Mendel and his theory of genetics, and kind of mushes them together to form a better understanding of how different characteristics, different traits are passed down through our genetics. So evolution now is thought to be a change in the allele frequency of a gene pool over multiple generations. So allele frequency is the frequency of dominant to recessive or various alleles. So some of our multigenic traits have many different forms of an allele. But how do those frequencies change over multiple generations? And by gene pool, I'm talking about all of the possible genes in a given population. So if we have a population of rabbits, they could have dark coats, they could have light coats, they could have coats with different shades, with different patterns on it. Those would all be different alleles, assuming they were all for the same trait, all different alleles of the same gene. So how do those genes change over many generations? Do they get more suited to the environment? Do they space out and become two different species? How do they affect the different generations? So, on Schoology, there is a link to an article about Darwin's finches. Darwin's finches are, like I said, a key species that we've used to understand how natural selection allows different species to be developed. So you'll want to read this article and create a one-sentence summary in your own words, explaining what's driving this change in beak shape in finches. So, overall, in this lesson, we've talked about Darwin, or we've talked about Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, his theory of use versus disuse, and how traits do get passed on, albeit not acquired traits. We've talked about Darwin, his theory of evolution, what led to it, what controversies there were. And Darwin, his main theory stated that without natural selection, we would not have changes in organisms. And that through natural selection, we are able to give rise to the many, many, many different species that are alive on the planet today. So tomorrow, we will jump into natural selection. We'll talk about how different traits are picked in nature from the gene pool and how different species can arise through things like isolation. Okay.